Good evening to all of you. At first, welcome to all of you in my YouTube channel. In this video, I will teach you the triumph of surgery. It is the first chapter of the book Footprints Without Fate. The chapter The Triumph of Surgery is all about a pet dog named Tricky. The owner of the dog was Mrs. Pumphrey. She was very rich. She loved the dog very much, and due to her excessive love, the dog became ill. So, before going to explain the text, let's understand about the characters. First of all, I will discuss about Mrs. Pumphrey. Mrs. Pumphrey was very rich lady. She loved her dog very much. She wanted to give each and every comfort and pleasure to the dog. Her almirah she had a lot of almirahs for Tricky. It means in all these almirahs, Tricky's dresses, bowls were kept. On the other hand, Tricky was a pet dog of a Tricky was very much greedy. Tricky could never avoid food. Whenever food had been given to Tricky, Tricky could eat it. And the writer James Herriot. James Herriot is a veterinary doctor, and he doctor and an author too. James Herriot wrote the stories on the basis of his personal experiences. So, what actually happened in the story? Tricky became ill. Tricky's condition became very much serious, and James Herriot treated Tricky or cured Tricky without giving any medicine. But the manner of treatment was completely unknown to Mrs. Pumphrey. She thought that Tricky was alright because of the surgery, and it was the victory, it was the triumph. It was the triumph, or it was the victory of surgery. But throughout the story, there was no surgery. Uh, no surgery had taken place. So, what actually happened? How Mr. Herriot treated Tricky? What kind of technique he had used? We'll have to understand. So, first of all, we'll have to understand the central message of the story. The central message of the story is that excessive of anything is poisonous, and we have to understand that. Now, let's start the story. Mrs. Pumphrey was walking with the dog on the street. Mr. Herriot saw them walking, so he immediately stopped the car. He was very much worried to see Tricky's condition. Tricky became excessively fat like a blotted sausage. Tricky's eyes became red and watery. Tricky's tongue was out of the mouth. Mr. Herriot asked Mrs. Pumphrey if she cut down the sweet things from his meal. Mrs. Pumphrey replied that she tried but she couldn't do so. The dog loved the chocolates, ice creams so much that she couldn't stop giving. The doctor also asked the lady if she had provided the dog exercise. Also, again the lady said that as the gardener was suffering from back pain, so no exercise had been given to the dog. Mr. Herriot understood that very soon Tricky's condition would be very critical, and he would be called for Tricky's treatment. So he had already planned something. According to his expectation, Tricky became seriously ill. Tricky left eating and drinking. Even Tricky denied to eat his favorite meals. Mrs. Pumphrey called Mr. Herriot. He came and convinced the lady to send the dog for at least 14 days to the hospital. Otherwise, the dog would not be alive. Mrs. Pumphrey was almost going to be unconscious to listen that she would have to remain separated from the dog, but she agreed. Mrs. All the servants were very much upset. They started bringing different kinds of bowls or covers for Tricky and kept inside the car. But Mr. Harriet understood that the space was not enough, so he moved the car. And when he looked back from his car, he found that everyone was in tears. Inside the clinic, Tricky was welcomed by the other dogs, but Tricky was listless as he had no energy. All the other dogs did not pay attention to Tricky, they left Tricky alone. Mr. Harriet made a special bed for Tricky and had provided nothing to eat. Mr. Harriet only provided water to drink. Mr. Harriet used his practical sense of treatment. Mr. Harriet understood that Tricky's health became bad because of his excessive eating. So, if Tricky would not eat anything for few days, Tricky would be automatically alright. So, in his surgery, he had not given any medicine to Tricky, but he had given a lot of water. And after 2 days, took improvement happened. uh, inside in the surgery, so many dogs lived. So Tricky very soon started taking interest with them. Tricky got back his strength and joined them at the meal time. And then after that, extra bowl had also been placed for Tricky. It was a great fun for Tricky to live with the other dogs, because at night they went for the hunting of rats. Tricky enjoyed the time very much. Tricky was almost alright, and the information had also been given to Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky was alright. Once she got the information, she was ecstatic, and she started sending dozen of eggs, wine, and brandy, everything. So for some time, Mr. Harriet was tempted. He thought that he would keep Tricky for a long period of time so that he could enjoy the egg or wine or brandy with his partners. But anyhow, he decided that the dog should have been returned because the dog was extremely all right. There was no problem. So he called Mrs. Pumphrey. She immediately came with a driver and picked the dog and returned back. According to her, it was the triumph of surgery, but actually no surgery took place. Tricky was treated by the practical sense of Mr. James Harriet. This story is based on his personal experience. This is not an imaginary story. This story is a real one. Means Mr. Harriet really treated Tricky and also given the information. So this story also tells us how can we handle pets. Keeping pets is easy, but to look them after is very much difficult. So in that case, Mrs. Pumphrey misunderstood that Tricky was suffering from malnutrition, and she provided excessive food, and due to that Tricky's health deteriorated and Tricky became excessively ill. So all those who love to keep pet, be careful in that. You must have complete information about the pets. So in this lesson, I think I have covered it up to. That's all. Thank you.